No one wanted to dance with the human scholar until an orc girl took his hand. "Please keep smiling. I think I'm about to fall." Valerie Knox's huge green hand closed around Nathaniel Brooks' fingers as the musicians began another dance. She was taller than every woman in the Bellcross town hall and stronger than most men, yet her grip trembled. Sweat shone across her brow despite the winter cold, and a dark stain spread beneath the cloth around her forearm. The bitter smell of dye chemicals rose from the bandage. Nathaniel had spent the evening being rejected by women who found his patched coat embarrassing. He forgot every humiliation the moment Valerie's knees weakened. He placed one arm around her waist and guided her toward the edge of the floor as, though her unsteady steps belonged to the dance, no one understood why the only orc woman in the hall had chosen the poorest scholar there. Nathaniel did not yet know that she had chosen him because he was the only person who had looked at her with concern instead of fear. Before we continue, tell us in the comments what made you smile today. Subscribe to Orc Bond Saga for more human-orc stories where a single act of kindness changes two lives forever. The winter social was meant to prove Bellcross had moved beyond the border wars. Human merchants hung blue ribbons, orc quarry workers donated stone lanterns, and musicians from both communities shared the platform. Yet humans crowded the food tables, while orcs remained near the entrance. The mayor promised fear would stay outside, but the room divided itself before the first song ended. Nathaniel belonged to neither side. At 28, he copied records, repaired damp ledgers, and translated border documents for Chief Archivist Holden, who signed the work as his own. Nathaniel earned enough for an attic room and little more. His coat was patched, one boot had been resoled with satchel leather, and ink stained his fingers. 3 women had refused him that evening. The last glanced at his clothes before saying her father was watching. He returned to the wall, knowing that learning could make a poor man useful without making him welcome. He had seen Valerie at Riverside Dyehouse, carrying wet cloth and turning drums built for 2 human workers. She was 25, broad-shouldered and nearly a head taller than him. Pigment darkened her fingers. Her plain green dress strained across her shoulders, and Rebecca's braided red cord rested at her waist. Nathaniel had thought she looked beautiful. He had not expected her to notice him. Now her weight sagged against his side. A human guest laughed nervously, and an orc worker started forward, but Valerie stopped him with a firm shake of her head. She did not want a scene. Nathaniel turned her slowly through the crowd until they reached a storage corridor. The moment the door closed behind them, Valerie leaned against the wall. Her breathing became rough, and her injured arm dropped beside her. She explained that a dye drum had cracked 3 days earlier. The liquid burned through her glove, but the supervisor wrapped the wound and ordered her back to work. Missing 1 shift meant losing 2 days of pay. Nathaniel loosened the cloth. Red lines had begun spreading toward her elbow, and pieces of dirty fabric clung to the burn. Valerie watched his face in disgust and found none. He told her the wound had to be cleaned. She answered that the healer charged more than a week's wages. Nathaniel had studied medical manuscripts at the academy. He admitted that reading about wounds was not the same as treating them, but infection would not wait for someone richer. Valerie's exhausted face almost softened into a smile. He borrowed water, salt, boiled linen, and strong spirits from the kitchen. Valerie sat on a flour barrel while he cleaned away dried pigment and cloth fibers. Her hand tightened around the wood, yet she did not cry out. Nathaniel explained each movement before making it. She asked what he expected in return. Nathaniel thought she meant money, and said he expected her to keep the bandage dry. Among Bellcross orcs, favors created debts, and tending a wound carried personal meaning. Nathaniel knew none of that. He only knew someone was hurt. Afterward, he brought bread and broth. Valerie tried to eat with dignity until hunger defeated her. By the time the music ended, she could barely stand. Her boarding house locked its doors at midnight and charged tenants for returning late. So Nathaniel offered the attic he rented above a candle shop. The room was so narrow that Valerie could nearly touch both walls. Its sloped ceiling forced her to bend near the window. Nathaniel owned one bed, one chair, a writing table, and shelves made from packing crates. The stove held more ash than coal, but the blankets were clean, the books carefully repaired, and a clay bowl waited beneath the leak in the roof. On the table stood a small wooden bird with one unfinished wing. The bed groaned beneath Valerie. Nathaniel placed another board under the frame and said it would hold. She asked where he intended to sleep. He pointed to the chair. Valerie called that foolish. Nathaniel answered that putting a feverish guest on the floor would be cruel. Her strength failed before the argument ended. She slept with one hand near the knife beneath her belt, while Nathaniel fed broken packing wood into the stove and changed the cloth on her arm. Near dawn, she muttered 3 words in the orc language. Nathaniel understood mother and river. The third word was paper. When the fever lowered, Valerie woke to onion soup and Nathaniel's only cup of tea beside the bed. She offered 3 copper coins. He refused. Valerie said unpaid help made her appear helpless. Nathaniel answered that being injured did not make her helpless. It only made her injured. For the first time, she accepted care without trying to repay it immediately. Valerie stayed 4 days. The infection receded, though her hand remained stiff. Nathaniel changed the bandage before archive work and returned each night with whatever food he could afford. She disliked his cooking and ate every bowl. On the second evening, she examined the unfinished wooden bird. Nathaniel said it had been meant for his younger sister. Valerie did not press. She shaped the damaged wing with 3 careful cuts and explained that her mother had repaired riverboats in Rusk Hollow. Valerie had wanted to become a joiner, but human guilds rejected orc women, and orc crews required clan sponsorship she no longer possessed. Riverside hired anyone strong enough to turn a drum. When Nathaniel asked why she left home, her face closed. She said remaining had become harder than leaving. He accepted the boundary. 2 nights later, sleet whispered across the roof. Valerie asked why the bird had only one wing. Nathaniel's sister, Amelia Brooks, had been 9 years younger. She loved the red-winged birds that gathered over the marsh and believed they carried messages to places without winter. Their father bound books, their mother washed clothes at the ferry inn, and Nathaniel taught Amelia letters from damaged pages customers discarded. He promised to carve her a bird before the first snow. Then fever entered their village. Their parents died within weeks, leaving 19-year-old Nathaniel with a 10-year-old sister who could not stop coughing. The village healer had medicine, but demanded silver. Nathaniel offered his father's tools, every book they owned, and years of labor. The cabinet remained locked. He carried Amelia through snow toward the main road, hoping for a traveling doctor. Beneath his coat, she asked whether the bird was finished. He told her it almost was. She died before sunrise beside a milestone. Nathaniel left the bird unfinished because completing it felt like admitting she would never return. He spent the following years studying laws, remedies, and the records powerful people used to decide whose pain mattered. Whenever he saw someone suffering, he still heard Amelia struggling to breathe. That was why he had helped Valerie. He could not stand beside another locked cabinet. Valerie closed her good hand around his wrist. In her settlement, the gesture meant another person's grief had been received without judgment. Nathaniel did not know the custom, but he understood the care. He turned his hand and held hers. After a long silence, Valerie spoke about her mother. Rebecca Knox repaired small riverboats in Rusk Hollow, though no guild granted her a title. Orc masters would not apprentice a married woman with a child, so she learned by watching from the bank and fixing skiffs for families who could not pay. She taught Valerie that good wood warned a patient hand before it broke. Valerie's father, Victor Knox, operated the rope ferry across the Grey Run. He was hard-working and gentle at home, but fear made him quiet whenever elders dismissed Rebecca. Valerie grew up among rope shavings and repair tools. Rebecca taught her letters from shipping labels because anyone asked to mark a contract deserved to know what stood above their name. When Valerie was 17, Rebecca discovered rot in the ferry's rear support. She wrote 3 warnings. One disappeared, one came back with an order to wait until the profitable season ended, and the last never reached the council. After Mountain Rain, 21 passengers boarded. Rebecca saw the platform sinking and ran aboard to move them forward. The beam broke halfway across. She pushed one child to the rail and caught another by the coat, but the grey run took her. Her body was found among willow roots 2 days later. The council called it weather. Valerie found Rebecca's warning beneath a clerk's ledger. Beside it was proof that repair money had paid for the council leader's son's marriage feast. She copied both pages and read them before the clan. The council accused her of theft. Workers who had praised Rebecca lowered their eyes because the ferry employed their relatives. Victor begged Valerie to apologize, terrified of losing his job and home after already losing his wife. The leaders offered to close the matter if Valerie surrendered the copies and married the clerk's nephew. He believed educated wives created disorder and promised she would never touch another record. Valerie refused before the entire hall. Elder Alexander Rowan, Rebecca's older cousin, called her reckless. He had spent years protecting orc laborers from dishonest human traders and believed clan unity was their only shield. Valerie answered that unity built over her mother's body was only fear. Older families called her disloyal, and construction crews withdrew the sponsorship Rebecca had arranged for her apprenticeship. Victor watched Valerie pack her tools beside the ferry and did not ask her to stay. She left before dawn with Rebecca's handplane, the red cord from her tool roll, and 8 copper coins. Bellcross was meant to be temporary, but every guild rejected her. Riverside Dyehouse hired her because the drums were heavy and no supervisor cared that she could read as long as she stayed silent. For 4 years, Valerie sent letters home. Victor never answered. When she finished, the stove had nearly died. Nathaniel did not tell her leaving had been brave or order her to forgive her father. He only said Rebecca had been right about the beam. No one had ever offered Valerie that truth without adding a lesson about loyalty. The next morning, she completed the wooden bird's second wing, but left one rough cut where Nathaniel's knife had stopped. The mark belonged to the story. Once Valerie could work again, their connection should have ended. Instead, she returned to Nathaniel's attic with coal, smoked fish, and a wooden support for the leaking roof. Among her people, she explained, anyone sheltered beneath another's roof came back carrying something that made the roof stronger. Their friendship grew through practical exchanges. Nathaniel taught her how to clean a wound without sealing dirt inside it. Valerie taught him to sharpen a knife properly. He helped her write a complaint about unsafe equipment. She repaired his table. He introduced her to apple pastries, which she called too sweet before eating 3. Soon Valerie began bringing Dyehouse workers who needed letters written. The first was Cassandra Hayes, a broad, loud orc woman whose hands were cracked by lie. Her only son, Mason Hayes, had left for the northern quarries and stopped writing 2 years earlier. Cassandra pretended not to worry. She dictated cheerful messages about weather, onions, and the supervisor's thinning hair, always asking whether Mason had warm boots. Then a bent envelope arrived. A quarry blast had taken Mason's left hand. The company paid for 3 nights of care and dismissed him. Ashamed to return, unable to lift stone, he had wandered between labor camps instead of coming home. Cassandra asked Nathaniel to read the letter twice. On the second reading, her face folded. Valerie held her damaged hands while she wept from relief, anger, and 2 years of imagined graves. Nathaniel spent nearly half his savings sending a reply north. When Valerie learned what he had done, she placed 5 copper coins beside his ink and said Cassandra's grief belonged to the whole room now. The choice changed their friendship. They were no longer exchanging favors. They were building a small place where burdens could be divided without shame. During those weeks, Nathaniel noticed that someone had been using his ink and moving old law books. Then Cassandra brought an anonymous notice found at the Dyehouse gate. It described how human and orc workers carried the same soaked cloth, breathed the same fumes, and returned each night to rooms owned by men who considered both groups replaceable. The page was signed River Hand. Essays under that name had appeared across Bellcross for months. They demanded safer factories, fair rents, and schools open to both communities. Officials called River Hand dangerous. Workers copied the pages before guards could tear them down. The truth emerged when Cassandra asked Nathaniel to read a letter in a difficult orc dialect. He stumbled over the second line. Valerie corrected him, then translated the entire paragraph without hesitation. After Cassandra left, Nathaniel placed a hidden sheet of paper on the table. The handwriting matched River Hand. Valerie waited for judgment. Nathaniel asked whether she had written the essay about warehouse rents. She admitted it. He told her the second paragraph was too long. Her surprise broke into laughter so strong that the bed frame cracked beneath her. The following morning, she repaired it with discarded oak, adding a central beam thick enough to hold 3 people her size. Nathaniel watched her hands work with precise confidence. Her strength was not something wild or frightening. It was the record of a life spent carrying what others could not. When the repair was finished, he said it was better than the original bed. Valerie observed that the original work had been human. He asked whether that was an insult. She said it was only evidence. Nathaniel began to understand when she was joking. After the secret was spoken, Nathaniel and Valerie worked together on every River Hand essay. He supplied dates, old laws, and the precise language hidden inside contracts. She removed the scholarly fog from his sentences and returned each argument to the person whose hand had been burned or whose rent had risen. One essay explained how iron bands could strengthen die drums. Another exposed higher rents charged to orc tenants. A third uncovered an old law requiring factory owners to pay for injuries caused by neglected equipment. Their first outing began as a practical trip to the Saturday market for a glove that would not trap dye against Valerie's. Scardot Bellcross woke beneath wet silver fog. Bargemen shouted along the grey run. Cart rims struck the cobbles, and the market smelled of fish smoke, cinnamon, damp wool, and dye minerals. Valerie walked beside Nathaniel in her work coat. She had been out of the Dyehouse only a week, and the injured hand still tightened whenever cold entered the scar. Nathaniel carried a folded list, though Valerie noticed he had arranged the items according to the direction of the stalls rather than importance. At a leather booth, the seller named a price almost twice the figure written on the board. He looked at Valerie's size, then at Nathaniel's patched coat, and decided neither would challenge him. Valerie placed one stained finger beside the written number. Her voice remained level as she asked how the glove had grown more expensive between the shelf and her hand. The seller looked toward Nathaniel. Expecting embarrassment or apology, Nathaniel asked whether the market inspector should compare the spoken price with the permit ledger. The seller gave them the glove at the marked amount. Valerie examined the stitching, flexed her fingers, and paid without gratitude. Once they had moved 2 stalls away, Nathaniel noticed the corner of her mouth. Lifting, she told him that human politeness was a strange weapon. She answered that orc directness was not exactly a hidden blade. Valerie bought him a meat pie in return and presented it with the seriousness of an honor gift. The pastry was too hot, and Nathaniel burned his tongue on the first bite. Valerie laughed so loudly that 3 merchants turned to stare. Nathaniel tried to look offended, but the sound of her laughter made dignity impossible. They ate beside the river wall while barges moved through grey water. Valerie removed the new glove and warmed her injured hand around a clay cup of broth. Nathaniel watched the way pain tightened her jaw. He asked whether it still hurt at night. Valerie admitted that it did, especially after long shifts. She had not told the supervisor because workers with permanent injuries were moved to lower wages. Nathaniel wanted to promise he would fix the law, the factory, and every person who had treated her as replaceable. He had learned enough from their argument to understand that promises made over another person's life could become another kind of control. Instead, he asked what she needed. Valerie considered the question before saying she needed someone to remind her that resting was not surrender. Nathaniel said he could do that. They walked through the flower lane afterward. Human couples bought cut roses wrapped in paper. Valerie studied the rows of severed stems and asked why courtship should be represented by plants already dying. Nathaniel explained that flowers were beautiful because their life was brief. Valerie replied that roofs were also brief compared with mountains. Yet no one presented a collapsing roof as romance. The following week, he brought her a potted rosemary plant. It could survive winter indoors, season food, and be divided into new roots when it grew too large. Valerie approved of its usefulness. She placed it on the only sunny ledge in her boarding room and threatened Cassandra when she tried to cut half of it for stew. In return, Valerie gave Nathaniel a carpenter's hammer, forged with a dark iron head and a handle fitted to his grip. It was still heavier than any tool he owned. He asked whether she expected him to build a house. Valerie said a lasting gift should leave room for ambition. He kept the hammer beside his books. Neither called the outing a date, but both guarded the memory. At winter's end, Valerie invited Nathaniel to the Night of Returning Lights. The festival began after sunset along the lower Grey Run. Orc families carried shallow wooden bowls with candles protected by rings of bark. The custom came from mountain settlements where travelers disappeared during storms. Lights were sent downriver so the lost would know that someone still expected them home. Valerie had avoided the ceremony since leaving Rusk Hollow. This year she brought a bowl repaired with Rebecca's red cord. Nathaniel carried Amelia's unfinished wooden bird inside his coat. The riverbank glowed with hundreds of small flames. Children ran through reeds with colored ribbons tied around their wrists. Older orcs wore clan patterns woven into shawls, and drums sounded slowly from the stone landing. Human residents watched from the bridge, curious but uncertain whether they were welcome. Nathaniel felt every glance as Valerie led him into the inner circle. Some watched with interest, others with disapproval. Their closeness was visible even without touch. Elder Alexander Rowan met them near the water. Rebecca's older cousin had become a respected defender of Bellcross orcs. His suspicion of human institutions had been earned, though time had hardened caution into a rule. Alexander asked whether River Hand now required a human keeper. Valerie's shoulders stiffened. She answered that Nathaniel was her collaborator, not her keeper. Alexander warned that human schools, courts and charities often entered orc communities carrying gifts and left carrying authority. Nathaniel did not deny the history. He said a warning could be true without becoming the only truth allowed. The answer unsettled Alexander more than defensiveness would have. Valerie reminded him that Rebecca's written warnings had been ignored by orc leaders. Alexander replied that one council's failure did not make every tradition corrupt. Valerie said tradition had protected the people who spent her mother's repair money. For a moment, grief stood between them more strongly than anger. Alexander looked at Rebecca's red cord around the bowl. His face softened, but pride kept him from apologizing. He stepped aside. At the water, Valerie placed her candle inside the repaired bowl. Nathaniel took out the wooden bird, intending to rest it beside Rebecca's light. Valerie stopped him. She made a second bowl from spare bark, placed a smaller candle inside, and set the bird across it. She said Amelia deserved a light that did not have to borrow space from anyone else's grief. They lowered both bowls together. The current caught them slowly. Rebecca's light turned once around Amelia's, then the two moved side by side into the field of flames. Valerie's breathing changed. Nathaniel did not ask her to explain. He stood close enough that their sleeves touched. She turned toward him and pressed her forehead to his. Among her people, the gesture meant that another person's thoughts had become a place of safety. It was more intimate than a public kiss and more serious than simple gratitude. Nathaniel's hands remained at his sides. He wanted to hold her, but he understood that receiving a custom meant allowing it to remain itself. Valerie stayed against him until the drumbeat changed. When she stepped away, the space between them felt newly aware. A week later, Nathaniel took her beyond the north road to an old willow above the marsh. In his village, families marked the first returning birds of spring by tying carved shapes to the branches. Some carried hopes, others carried the names of those who had not survived winter. They crossed thawing fields until Nathaniel slipped in a ditch. Valerie lifted him bodily to the other side and observed that human pride weighed less than expected. At the willow, Nathaniel took out Amelia's bird. Valerie had repaired the unfinished wing, but left the final rough edge for him. He sat beneath the branches and worked with his small knife while Valerie waited nearby. The last cut required almost no effort. For years, he had believed finishing the bird would close the final door between himself and his sister. Instead, the completed shape seemed to release the child from the moment beside the milestone. Amelia was no longer only the body he had failed to carry far enough. She became the girl who believed birds delivered messages beyond winter. Nathaniel tied the carving to a low branch. The wind lifted it into motion. His grief arrived without warning. He covered his face, ashamed of the sound that escaped him. Valerie knelt despite the mud and pulled him against her chest. Her arms enclosed him fully, strong enough to feel like shelter. Rather than restraint, she did not tell him to stop crying. She did not say Amelia was in a better place, or that time healed everything. She held him until the hardest part passed. When Nathaniel could breathe again, he admitted that he had spent years turning guilt into proof that he still loved his sister. Letting go of blame felt like letting go of her. Valerie said Rebecca had taught her that a repaired boat did not insult the storm that broke it. It only meant the people inside deserved to keep traveling. Nathaniel rested his hand over hers. He asked whether she wanted to write to Victor again. Valerie had already sent 43 unanswered letters. Each had carried a smaller piece of hope, until the last contained almost none. Nathaniel suggested that the next should not beg. She could tell her father what she had built, and allow him to decide whether he wished to know the woman she had become. That evening, Valerie wrote the 44th letter at Nathaniel's table. She told Victor about Bellcross, Riverhand, Cassandra, the repaired dye drums, and the scholar who had cleaned her wound without asking for obedience. She did not apologize for leaving. At the end, she wrote that Rebecca's red cord still held. Nathaniel read the page only after. Valerie asked him to check the spelling. He changed. Nothing, ordinary workdays and tired silences separated each meeting, making every return matter more. Their feelings grew inside shared work. Nathaniel remembered which hand hurt in cold weather. Valerie learned that crowded rooms made him rub the seam of his coat when he felt judged. He kept strong black tea for her. She widened narrow shelves and repaired the floorboard that always caught his boot. Neither called it love, both had begun measuring absence by the shape the other left behind. Henry Sullivan forced the first real break between them. Henry owned Riverside, Dyehouse, and used the struggle to keep it open as an excuse for delayed repairs. Weak gloves and reduced wages. He placed a Riverhand essay on Nathaniel's table. It described Valerie's burn and cited the forgotten injury law. Henry argued that reinforcing every drum would cost more than the factory earned in a month. Nathaniel asked how many damaged hands the business could afford. Before iron bands became cheaper, Henry warned that merchant donations supported the archive and that a poor scholar should choose enemies carefully after he left. Valerie told Nathaniel to stop helping with the essays. She had not asked him to risk the only stable work he possessed. Nathaniel said he could not read injury records and then pretend ignorance. Valerie answered that workers who lost wages could not survive on his conscience. The argument grew sharper because both were trying to protect the other. Nathaniel treated sacrifice as something he could choose alone. Valerie heard another educated person making plans over laborers who would pay the cost. She left without taking the lantern he had prepared. For 6 days, the attic felt wrong. Nathaniel noticed the repaired bed, the rosemary on the ledge, and the heavy hammer beside his books. At the Dyehouse, Valerie kept storing small stories to tell him before remembering they were no longer speaking. The separation ended when 3 days of rain pushed the grey run over its lower wall. Water entered the dye yard before dawn, carrying broken crates and leaking pigment into the streets. Nathaniel heard the factory bell from the archive and ran before Chief Holden could stop him. Valerie stood waist-deep near a storage room where a fallen beam trapped 2 young workers. Her injured arm shook under the weight. Nathaniel could not match her strength, so he found an iron bar, pushed it beneath the timber, and used a broken barrel as a pivot. Valerie understood the plan without explanation. Together they raised the beam. The workers crawled free just as the rear wall split. Valerie shoved Nathaniel toward the exit, but the current swept her down. He caught Rebecca's red cord around her waist and held until 2 laborers dragged them into the yard. They collapsed in colored mud beneath hard rain. Nathaniel apologized first. He admitted that helping did not give him the right to decide what risks others should carry. Valerie admitted that depending on someone felt more dangerous than lifting the beam alone. He told her she did not have to depend on him for everything, only for what was too heavy to carry alone. She pressed her forehead to his. This time Nathaniel placed both hands at her waist. Neither pretended the gesture meant only friendship. If their trust feels earned to you, tell us whether love begins in dramatic rescues or in the quieter moment when 2 people finally admit they need each other. Stay with the Orc Bond saga, because the hardest part of Valerie and Nathaniel's journey is still ahead. The flood closed Riverside for 3 weeks. Henry could not pay full wages and lacked insurance because he had hidden previous violations. Valerie proposed that unpaid wages become worker shares, that accounts be opened, and that an elected safety council-approved repairs. Henry resisted until the dispute reached the town chamber. Nathaniel found an old law allowing labor debt to become ownership if the terms were explained in language every worker understood. He translated it into common human speech and the River Orc dialect. Holden discovered the copies and dismissed him for distributing municipal records. Nathaniel left the archive carrying his coat, 3 pens, and Amelia's bird pattern. At the hearing, Henry's lawyer claimed Valerie could not have written the River Hand essays. He suggested Nathaniel had placed clever words in an orc worker's mouth. Valerie stopped Nathaniel from answering. She stood before the council in plain work clothes, blue dye beneath her nails, and the burn scar visible. She explained the repair costs, the wage losses, and the ownership. Planned without looking toward Nathaniel once. Henry finally admitted that fear of losing his brother's business had made every delayed repair easier. Then the last, the Cooperative passed by 1 vote. Henry kept a smaller share and handled sales. Workers received written protections and access to the accounts. The first months remained difficult, but the old silence did not return. Nathaniel began writing letters and contracts beneath the awning of Cassandra's boarding house. People paid with coins, bread, or whatever they could spare. The evening school began with Zoe Flynn, a 9-year-old orc girl who waited by the Dyehouse gate while her mother worked. She watched Nathaniel write Cassandra's name and asked what the mark sounded like. Nathaniel drew the first letter of Zoe's name. She copied it backward. Valerie corrected the direction, and Zoe tried until 3 uneven letters stood on the slate. She carried it home beneath her shirt to protect it from rain. The next evening she returned with 2 children. Within a week, 12 students crowded beneath Cassandra's awning. An unused bakery storeroom became their classroom. Flour dust covered the floor. Mice had opened the lower wall, and the roof leaned toward the alley. Valerie replaced boards. Nathaniel scraped walls, and Cassandra washed windows while complaining that everyone else had chosen easier work. Alexander opposed a mixed school, fearing human law would replace orc memory. Valerie invited him to teach clan history. He refused, though less firmly after seeing Zoe write her name in both alphabets. At the first lesson, Nathaniel began with names because the first word a student learned should belong entirely to them. Zoe broke her chalk twice before completing every letter. Valerie turned toward the window to hide tears. Rebecca had taught her secretly beneath a boat frame. Zoe could learn openly in a room built by both peoples. A human mother removed her son, then returned him after he copied Zoe's lessons in secret. An orc father challenged a map that erased 3 settlement names. Nathaniel admitted the error and corrected it before the class. Alexander still refused to teach, but he stopped asking families to leave. The school changed the rhythm of Nathaniel and Valerie's days. They earned money in the mornings, repaired the room in the afternoons, and taught until their voices became rough. They walked home after dark, beneath laundry lines and chimney smoke. One evening, spring warmth remained on the river stones. They took the longer path. Valerie admitted that she had spent years believing she failed Rebecca, Victor, and the future her mother imagined for. Her dad Nathaniel said a 17-year-old girl could not repair every rotten beam in a settlement. Valerie asked whether the same mercy applied to a brother who could. Not by medicine. The question stopped. Him. They stood beside the grey run until he understood that guilt could become a shelter people hid inside because it felt safer than forgiveness. Nathaniel reached for her hand. Valerie closed her fingers around his. They walked the rest of the path slowly, their joined hands swinging between bodies built on very different scales. Their first kiss came weeks later in the school doorway. Nathaniel brought another rosemary plant because the first had outgrown its pot. He began explaining respect, companionship, and the difficulty of understanding or courtship. Valerie waited until he ran out of useful sentences. Then she asked whether he was trying to kiss. Nathaniel admitted that he was. She bent and kissed him first. The kiss began gently, but neither moved away when it should have ended. Nathaniel's hand rose to the side of her neck. Valerie's palm settled against his back, broad enough to hold him securely. The rosemary remained trapped between them until a leaf brushed Nathaniel's nose and made them laugh. When they separated, Valerie's breathing had changed. She told him that in orc custom, a first kiss was not a promise, but it was never meaningless. Nathaniel answered that he did not want it to be meaningless. That night, he lay awake in the attic, feeling the memory of her mouth long after the stove went cold. Alexander called Valerie a traitor after seeing her leave the school with Nathaniel's hand inside hers. He did not shout. His disappointment was quieter and more painful. He reminded her that human men had often desired orc women in private while choosing human respectability in public. Valerie told him Nathaniel had already lost his archive position beside the workers. Alexander answered that one sacrifice did not erase generations of warning. Nathaniel offered to confront him, but Valerie refused. Alexander belonged to her history. She would answer him herself. The greater test came from Nathaniel's past. Natalie Harper arrived from the Capital Academy in early summer. She had studied beside Nathaniel and had once been the woman he expected to marry. She cared for him, but when her family learned he had no inheritance, she chose the safety of another match. That engagement had since ended. Natalie entered the school in a clean traveling coat carrying an academy offer. She praised Nathaniel's river handwork and spoke with the ease of someone who remembered him before the patched clothes. Valerie disliked the private memories that made them smile and hated feeling jealous of a woman whose hands had never been stained by dye. The position offered Nathaniel proper rooms, steady pay, and the teaching career once denied him. Its condition was hidden beneath polite language. He must distance himself from Riverhand and keep his relationship with an orc craftswoman out of public view. Nathaniel did not accept. He also concealed that Natalie asked to meet him alone. He told himself he wanted more information. In truth, a wounded part of him wanted to be desired by the woman who had once found him insufficient. They met in a quiet inn. Natalie admitted she had been cowardly and said she had thought of him for years. Nathaniel answered that no career worth having could require him to hide Valerie. Natalie kissed him. For one terrible moment, Nathaniel did not pull away. Old humiliation and the satisfaction of finally being chosen moved through him together. Then he stepped back, named the kiss for what it was, and left. Valerie was across the street. Cassandra had mentioned seeing him enter with a well-dressed woman, and through the rain-blurred window, Valerie had seen enough. Nathaniel followed her to the river. He did not blame Natalie or disguise weakness as confusion. When Valerie asked whether he had kissed her back, he admitted that he had, briefly. The truth did not soften the wound. Valerie said Alexander's warning had entered her mind the instant she saw them. She had trusted Nathaniel with the fear that human respectability might someday matter more than an orc. Woman with stained hands, Nathaniel said he loved her. Valerie answered that love spoken after betrayal did not repair trust. For 12 days they worked in the same school without being alone. Their careful politeness hurt more than anger. Nathaniel refused the academy in writing. He did not use Valerie as his excuse. He explained that an institution demanding secrecy about the people who shaped him had not truly changed. He showed Valerie the letter, but asked for nothing. One evening she found him repairing a shelf. She said she did not need him to become poorer or less ambitious to prove love. She needed to know he would not use another woman's desire to soothe an old wound. Nathaniel admitted that Natalie had awakened the rejected boy inside him. For one moment he had fed that boy at Valerie's expense. He promised honesty before shame could become secrecy again, not impossible perfection. Valerie said trust would return through repeated actions. A week later, she invited him to walk beside the river. Their hands brushed several times before she took his. She still had questions, and Nathaniel answered them without impatience. When Natalie wrote again, he gave Valerie the unopened letter. Valerie returned it and said the decision belonged to him. He burned it because he no longer needed rejection, reversed to know his worth. The reconciliation remained slow. Valerie asked questions when jealousy rose, instead of allowing silence to grow teeth. Nathaniel told her whenever Natalie wrote again and later. Burned the unopened final letter only after Valerie said the decision belonged to him. Their second first kiss happened in the attic. During a thunderstorm, rain struck the roof, and the repaired bed frame held while they sat facing each other. Valerie touched his cheek and told him she was still angry in places. Nathaniel said he understood. She kissed him anyway. The kiss was not gentle this time. It carried hurt, relief, hunger, and the fear of nearly losing what they had built. Valerie lifted him onto the edge of the bed with an ease that made his breath catch. Nathaniel's hands moved over the strength of her shoulders and the soft curve beneath her plain dress. She stopped and asked whether he wanted. Nathaniel answered without hesitation. He asked the same. Valerie's answer came through the fierce way. She pulled him close. They did not rush beyond what trust could bear. Clothing loosened slowly. Scars were touched without pity. Nathaniel learned that Valerie's sighs made tenderness more deliberate, not less possible. Valerie learned that his gentleness could carry desire strong enough to meet her own. They spent the night together. By dawn, the room smelled of rain, rosemary, warm skin, and the dying stove. Nathaniel woke against her chest with no shame in the quiet between them. Their intimacy did not erase the betrayal. It marked the moment they chose to begin rebuilding beyond it. Autumn brought 2 returns. The first was a letter from Victor. His hand shook across the page. He admitted that he had received every letter and hidden them beneath Rebecca's old tool chest because answering meant facing the morning he allowed Valerie to leave. He did not ask forgiveness. He wrote that the Ferry Council had finally been removed after another inspection exposed stolen repair money. At the bottom, he asked whether the red cord still held. Valerie cried against Nathaniel's shoulder, then wrote back that it did. The second return was Cassandra's son. Mason reached Bellcross just before the first frost. His left sleeve was pinned beneath the shoulder, and quarry dust remained inside the seams of a coat he had worn for weeks. The blast that took his hand had not been sudden. Workers had reported a widening crack in the quarry face for 3 days. The overseer continued because delaying the cut would cost a shipment. Mason pushed another man aside when the stone broke. He remembered the sound, the weight across his arm, and waking in an infirmary with part of himself missing. The quarry paid for 3 nights and dismissed him. He spent 2 years moving between labor camps, ashamed to return to Cassandra unable to lift stone. He survived by counting wagons and warning crews about unsafe faces, though employers paid him less because inspection was not considered real work. At the end of Cassandra's street, he stopped. Cassandra crossed the distance, struck him once on the chest and pulled him into her arms. Relief came out of her as anger, because anger was easier to carry in public. Mason's first day at the school was difficult. He tried to repair a loose step with one hand, dropped the tool, and kicked the wood hard enough to split it. Valerie did not help immediately. She sat beside him and asked how he had known the quarry wall would fall. Mason described hairline fractures, damp stone, and the way dust shifted before a break. Valerie placed a slate in front of him. She told him Bellcross had enough people who could lift beams and too few who could see danger before the lifting became necessary. Nathaniel taught him written measurements. Zoe tied chalk to a leather loop that fitted around his remaining hand. Within months, Mason became the school's safety inspector and the first person workers called when a wall began speaking through cracks. His skill mattered when winter arrived early. Coal barges were delayed, but North Bank Clothworks owner Richard Blackwood had purchased most of the supply. He stored it legally and sold it at 4 times the autumn price, hoping Riverside's Cooperative would fail and return its contracts to him. The school became a warming room. Families slept beneath tables while Cassandra cooked thin soup, and Mason rebuilt the stove channels to hold heat longer. Zoe noticed that North Bank's tally listed the same shipment twice. Nathaniel found an emergency law requiring any merchant controlling more than half the town's fuel to release a portion at the previous season's average price. The mayor refused to enforce it. Valerie published the figures. Richard's workers faced the hardest choice. Human stoker Jalen Moore had 3 children and owed Richard rent. Orc loader Drainer Carl supported an injured mother. Both knew the warehouse records were false. Richard offered fuel to anyone who signed a statement supporting him. Jalen signed. Drainer refused. That night, Jalen found his daughter sharing her blanket with an orc child whose home had no coal. The shame followed him back to work. When officers arrived to close the warming room for overcrowding, Alexander blocked the door with his staff. Dock workers, Henry's cooperative board, and parents from both communities joined him. Then Jalen crossed the officers' line. He admitted signing Richard's statement and produced the true unloading ledger, proving 6 wagons had been hidden behind a false wall. Drainer and the night crew stood beside him. The mayor declared an emergency before sunset. Coal left the warehouses at the regulated price. Richard dismissed Jalen and Drainer, but Riverside employed them during spring expansion. The crisis did not end poverty. It proved that fear could divide 2 peoples only, while each believed the other would remain silent. By spring, the school needed the empty shop beside the bakery. Nathaniel saw rent they could barely afford. Valerie saw wide windows, a back kitchen, and enough room for benches that would not collapse. Beneath orc students, she proposed to him there, with the measuring cord still in her hand. She wanted the front rooms for the river hand, school and the back rooms for a home. She wanted Nathaniel as her husband, not because he had saved her, but because he had learned how to stand beside her without. Standing over her, Nathaniel accepted. Wedding preparation lasted 6 weeks and tested their patience more than the council hearing. Valerie wanted a dark green working dress reinforced at the shoulders, with Rebecca's red cord sewn into the waist. Cassandra insisted a bride required silver embroidery. Alexander wanted traditional clan leather. Nathaniel watched the three argue until Valerie combined all of it: plain cooperative cloth, a narrow silver border, and leather wrist guards stamped with Rebecca's boat mark. Nathaniel repaired his father's old binding awl and used it to fasten a small wooden bird inside his coat. He wanted Amelia and his parents present without turning the wedding into a funeral. Victor arrived 2 days before the ceremony. He stood beneath the school sign holding Rebecca's handplane. Valerie met him in the doorway. For several minutes they spoke only about the road, the river level, and the quality of the shop roof. Then Victor saw the red cord above the entrance. He admitted that he had watched Valerie leave because fear made silence feel safer than choosing his daughter. Every year afterward, he had repaired ferry ropes for people who still praised Rebecca while pretending they had not abandoned her. Valerie told him that his silence had wounded her almost as deeply as the council's accusation. Victor accepted the words without defense. He placed Rebecca's plane in her hands and said it had always belonged to the person brave enough to use. Valerie did not forgive everything that afternoon. She allowed him to help widen the final doorway. They worked side by side until sunset, speaking first about wood and later about grief. At the wedding, human and orc guests sat at the same long tables. Some left early. Others discovered that passing bread was easier than defending old hatred. Valerie and Nathaniel joined hands before the registrar, pressed their foreheads together according to her custom, and promised that neither would carry pain alone, merely to appear strong. That night, in the rooms behind the school, the oak bed waited beneath clean blankets. Their wedding intimacy was tender at first and fierce once nervousness passed. Nathaniel traced the scar on Valerie's arm, not as damage, but as part of the road that brought her to him. Valerie touched the places where poverty and grief had made him feel undesirable and replaced embarrassment with open affection. The reinforced frame groaned but survived. Afterward, they laughed beneath the blanket, and Nathaniel admitted that fear and desire were not always opposites. Married life was less graceful than the ceremony. Valerie moved every shelf higher because she struck her hips against them. Nathaniel moved the spices lower because he could not reach them. She salted stew like an orc labor camp while he folded blankets with unnecessary precision. Their first serious argument concerned whether tools belonged beside the bed. They solved it by building another wall rack and laughing over how carefully two stubborn people could negotiate 6 inches of wall. Desire became part of their ordinary life. Some nights they reached for each other slowly after long lessons. Other nights' reunion carried a rougher hunger, always checked by a question, a nod, or the familiar touch of forehead to forehead. The oak bed became the one place where neither had to be useful or brave. A little more than a year after the wedding, Valerie began waking with nausea. She blamed the Dyehouse fumes until Cassandra watched her refuse black tea and silently placed both hands over her mouth. The healer confirmed that Valerie was carrying a child. Joy arrived with fear attached. Bellcross healers had cared for human and orc mothers, but few understood a pregnancy between the two peoples. They could not promise whether it would follow human timing, orc growth, or something between. They advised rest, food, and fewer hours near harsh chemicals. They also explained that uncertainty did not mean disaster. Nathaniel filled 3 notebooks with questions until Valerie took away his pen. She reminded him that their child needed a father, not a frightened clerk recording every danger. He began making a cradle anyway. Valerie designed it wider than a human cradle and lower than an orc one. Nathaniel built adjustable sides, while she carved riverbirds along the rails. At night they discussed names. They were not ready to speak in daylight. During the 12th week, pain woke Valerie before sunrise. At first she tried to dress for work. Nathaniel saw the fear beneath her anger and sent Zoe for the healer. The cramps grew stronger, followed by bleeding that neither could misunderstand. By afternoon, the healer gently confirmed that the pregnancy had ended. No one blamed Valerie's work, her body, Nathaniel's humanity, or the difference between their species. Sometimes a pregnancy ends despite every careful choice. The truth removed fault, but not grief. Valerie asked everyone to leave the bedroom. Nathaniel obeyed. He sat outside, with his back against the door, close enough for her to hear him breathing. Near midnight she opened it. Wrapped in a blanket, she looked emptied by exhaustion. Nathaniel did not touch her until she reached for him. Then her strength broke. She sank against his chest with a low, wounded sound, as though grief had torn through every place pride once guarded. For days, Nathaniel tried to talk while Valerie tried to work. He dismantled the unfinished cradle because seeing it returned him to Amelia's final morning. Valerie found the rails stacked behind the school and accused him of erasing their child. Nathaniel admitted that he had begun believing loss followed him, and that his hope had somehow placed her in danger. Valerie's grief became anger. The pregnancy had belonged to both of them, but her body had carried the pain. She could not also carry his belief that he had poisoned their future. Nathaniel recognized that guilt had again made another person responsible for comforting him. He apologized without asking for immediate forgiveness. Valerie admitted that work had become her hiding place. In Rusk Hollow, mourners were expected to stand through the first remembrance meal to prove grief had not weakened the household. She had spent her life confusing silence with endurance. They did not solve their sorrow that night. They sat beside the dismantled cradle until sunrise and spoke only when words came honestly. Cassandra brought food and guarded the door. Alexander closed the school for 3 days without asking. Zoe left a slate outside, bearing 2 hands around a candle. Victor traveled from Rusk Hollow and repaired a loose shutter because practical work was the only comfort he knew. Nathaniel carved a tiny bird from the cradle wood. It carried no name or date. He and Valerie rebuilt the frame together and placed the bird inside. They did not prepare it for another baby. They kept it because brief hope had still been real. Physical closeness changed after the loss. For weeks, Valerie did not want to be touched below the shoulders, and Nathaniel never treated patience as a debt. Even after the healer confirmed her body had recovered, desire returned unevenly. Months later, they began kissing on the oak bed. The closeness became intense. Then Valerie suddenly went still. Pain lived in memory even when her body was safe. Nathaniel stopped immediately. Valerie cried because one part of her wanted him while another felt pleasure betrayed the child they had lost. Nathaniel held her without trying to continue. Intimacy was not a test, and grief did not own her body. Several nights later, Valerie reached for him. They moved slowly, asking and answering through words, pauses, and touch. Tears came, but so did warmth. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, not an attempt to create another child or escape the one they lost. It was 2 grieving people choosing to remain alive inside the same bed. The loss never became a lesson they were grateful to receive. Some mornings remained hard. The cradle stayed near the wall, and the tiny bird gathered dust until one of them cleaned it. A year later, factory fever left 2 children without parents. Lucas Brooks was a quiet human boy of 7 who hid bread because hunger had taught him meals could disappear. Cara Knox was a 5-year-old orc girl who bit anyone trying to touch her hair. They came to the school needing safety, not replacing anyone. After winter rain flooded the children's lodging, Valerie and Nathaniel brought them into the rooms behind the school. Nathaniel worried they were trying to escape old grief. Valerie reminded him that loving Lucas and Cara would not rewrite the child they had lost. A heart could remember one life while making room for others. On their first school day, Lucas refused to enter the crowded room. Cara went inside, returned, and took his hand. At home, Nathaniel found bread beneath Lucas's mattress and placed a covered basket beside it, promising it would be filled each morning. Valerie gave Cara a wooden comb and allowed her to decide who could touch her hair. The word family came slowly. During a thunderstorm, both children appeared beside the oak bed. Valerie lifted them beneath the blankets while Nathaniel made space. Lucas asked whether they would still be there after the storm. Nathaniel told him they would be there. After many storms, Cara pressed her forehead to Valerie's and then to Nathaniel's. She noticed the tiny bird inside the unused cradle, and Valerie explained only that it belonged to someone their family remembered with love. Kara touched one carved wing and left it there. From that night on, the children called their parents. Each year, Bellcross held another winter dance. On the third anniversary, Nathaniel stood for a moment beside the wall where no one had wanted him. The ribbons and stone lanterns remained, but the room no longer divided itself cleanly by species. Valerie crossed the floor wearing Rebecca's red cord and her scar openly. She was not ill or asking him to hide her weakness. She held out her hand because she still chose him. Their love had survived poverty, jealousy, one real betrayal, winter hunger, the loss of a child, and the ordinary difficulty of sharing a life. It had not united kingdoms. It had made a factory safer, opened a school, brought a son home, kept children warm, and given two grieving people a bed where neither had to pretend. Nathaniel took her hand. When the music ended, neither let go. Subscribe to Orc Bond Saga for more emotional human-orc stories where imperfect people choose love through fear, mistakes, grief, and second chances. Share Valerie and Nathaniel's journey with someone who believes being truly seen can change an ordinary life forever.